Welcome to Chapter 12 material where we talk about pricing. A little introduction to this chapter. We're going to talk a few things that are outside the realm of marketing and more of for the purposes of ensuring that we have a good understanding of basic principles of pricing. And what I mean by that is we'll talk a couple of things that are economic theories, but do play a role in understanding consumer behavior as it relates to price. And so what we're going to talk about in sport pricing really delves into this idea of how marketers affect consumers' perceptions of price and how that influences their behavior. So you can see our foundation, the things we're going to talk about, overview that is. We'll start with first with the foundations, talk about some core issues. Then we'll talk about factors that influence price. We'll talk about some standard approaches that you can take from this class and hopefully implement into whatever company you work for, whether it's in sport or not. Some of these things will be basic principles of pricing, and then we'll transition to some things that are approaches to sport pricing. So let's begin with some foundation, some basic understanding. At the basic level, we know that pricing is one of the 4 P's of the marketing mix, and we know that it is essential to the financial success of any organization, period. So let's take the 4 P's. You can create a great product, meaning one that customers like, has a high level of quality. We've talked about that in Chapter 12. We can distribute that product to our clients in a way that is efficient and effective. That is our place marketing. We'll talk about that later on. And we can promote it in a way, sending the marketing messages that try to encourage them to buy our products. And we can do all of that the best way possible. But if we don't price the product in a way that would make us profitable, in a way that will basically affect our consumers in a positive way, if we can't do that, then we're not going to be profitable. So we could argue that price is one of the only parts of the marketing mix that directly affects the revenue of an organization. Because you can do everything else right, but if you don't price it right, you won't be profitable. The problem is a lot of people in many industries go into pricing not really understanding it and saying, you know what, somebody else will figure it out. We'll still be profitable. Let's just set the price. Yeah, we'll figure it out later. Well, the problem with that is if you don't have a basic understanding, then you're not going to be profitable, and in the long run, it'll hurt you. So price is very critical for a number of reasons. First one is that prices readily change in most industries. And for example, let's take team sports or sporting events. Those that become more popular due to a variety of factors, which we'll talk about later in this chapter, can cause prices to rise or fall for ticketing to events. In a market where the demand is elastic, we'll talk about that in a second, price is one of the most effective tools that marketers can use to change demand in consumers' perceptions. Price is also highly visible to the consumer. Anytime you walk into a store, many times the first thing people look at is price. While you're maybe finding a certain brand, you still pay attention to the price. You know how much it is at other places, or you may have a general idea. You may not know anything at all, and the first thing you look at is price. And so usually price is a proxy for quality as well. And then that price is never far from the consumer's mind because it is a big part of a consumer's decision. So it's very important to us as marketers to understand price. Another reason why it's important is many times if you look at what our research shows us is that, and I mentioned it before, if consumer has a high level of satisfaction, they'll be more likely to purchase the product in the future. In other words, higher levels of satisfaction lead to higher levels of repurchase intentions. And so if we're concerned with satisfaction so that we can have repeat business, we have to ensure, well, how do we define satisfaction? And so this equation that's on your screen is important. Satisfaction is our benefits minus our costs. Our benefits minus our cost. Another way to look at this is the value function, which we'll talk about in a second. But if our benefits outweigh the cost the consumer has, basically if the consumer benefits outweigh the cost that they're putting into the product, then they'll deem it to be satisfied. If they basically even out, we'll still see some levels of satisfaction, but our goal is to meet or exceed satisfaction, preferably exceed. And so many of the times we don't have control over how the consumer perceives the benefit. We do have, in some respects, the way that we create the event so it's a positive experience, or the product that we're creating is high quality. Yeah, all of that, we can help build this idea of benefit. But one thing that we absolutely have control over is the cost. And this is the cost not only in the price that they're paying, but also, and cost is the most visible part of this equation, price is a big part of what the cost is. So we will talk about it later, but there are other things that go along with buying a product. That is transactional cost. Transactional cost being the cost in the form of time. So the more time I spend on the purchase, the more likely, the higher the benefit needs to be. And so maybe I'm trying to find a deal, so I'll spend more time trying to find that deal because it's worth it to me as a consumer. So cost is not just the price, but it's also things such as transactional cost, which is the cost in the form of time. We also know customers typically make decisions based on the following ranking. First is price, then is value, which we'll talk about value equation in a second. Then it's about the brand, then it's about the selection variety underneath that brand, and then finally it's the service that goes along with the purchase of that good or service for that matter. So how do we define price? Well, price, for the definition people in the world, you want to have one, here it is. What the buyer gives up in the exchange process is the definition of price. Another way to word it is it's the amount of money that the buyer pays to gain rightful ownership in the product being offered for sale. And so price is, again, something that we set from the consumer's, from the producer's standpoint. So I keep mentioning this thing called the value equation. Value equation is similar to how we look at satisfaction. However, if you remember I just showed you how consumers make decisions in their purchases. Number one is price and number two is value. Well, how do we define value? Value is our perceived benefit over the price of that sport product. Now, in this way is very similar to how we're looking at the level of satisfaction. So if a consumer is satisfied with their purchase, benefits outweigh a cost. If they find a high value in the product, then our benefits are greater than the price that we pay. And so in this equation, if we were to quantify the benefits, we would say that the benefits number needs to be greater than the price number. And so, for example, if our benefits are not worth the price, then we would have a less than 1 number here in this equation, and therefore our value would be lower. So in all, for purpose of explaining this, our benefits have to be greater than our price in order to have a value. And we know that's the reason why people buy it. Another term, and this is where we start to move a little bit away from the marketing aspect, but still is something that's important because it affects our consumers' perceptions and behaviors, is this idea of price elasticity. Price elasticity is a measure that reflects the change in the level of demand in the response to a change in price. In other words, if the amount of demand for a product changes because price changes, then we have what we're talking about here is price elasticity. So it is, again, a measure of the market's response to price changes. If I increase the price, what's going to happen is really what we're talking about here. So if we look at first this idea of the elastic demand curve. In the elastic demand curve, we see, again, prices change, so does demand. And so in an elastic demand curve, we're talking about an inverse relationship between price and total revenue. And so many times people think, well, if I just raise the price and they're in an elastic demand curve, they may think, if I just raise the price, then I'm going to make more money because I'm assuming that demand is going to stay constant. Well, we'll show in a second why that may not be true in an elastic demand curve. So we know that because of this inverse relationship, if we increase prices, our total revenue might actually decline. And in the same way, if our prices are decreased, then our total revenue might actually increase. So we'll show an example of this. So here is, I think in the next slide, I talk about soccer balls. So we'll say this is a soccer ball. I can say that currently I know that if I sell my soccer ball for $10, that the demand characteristic, this is based on my sales forecasting and the knowledge I know about my business, that if I sell it for $10, I'm going to have 1,000 people want to buy a soccer ball. If I do the math, 1,000 times $10 is $10,000. You might say, okay, well, I'm going to assume that demand is going to stay constant. Let's raise it by $15. Well, if I assume demand stayed constant, then I would be essentially in an inelastic demand curve. If I raised it by $5 and assumed demand did not change, that would be an inelastic demand curve, and I would make $15,000. However, what we're talking about here is an elastic, where price and demand do fluctuate based on characteristics with each other. So if I raise the price in this by $5, my demand might decrease to $600, which is actually, based on the decrease in demand, I'm actually losing money by increasing my price. And as you can see, so on and so forth. Really, you might say, well, if I'm in an elastic demand curve, I might not want to raise prices because, again, my total revenue would decline unless, and this is where marketing comes into play, unless you believe that you're trying to add a prestige type aspect to your product. So I might say, well, everybody's selling their soccer balls for $10. I'm in an elastic demand curve. If I raise it $5, that might change the perception of my brand as a whole. I might lose money in my soccer ball category, but my soccer cleats might go up. And so a lot of times we have to be careful with, well, just because you raise price doesn't mean you're going to make more money. It may actually decrease the amount of revenue you get. This is just a graphical display of what I just told you. So what about an inelastic demand curve? That's what I just discussed. What happens when the markets don't change? In other words, what happens if demand stays constant and you lower or raise the price? Well, typically, if demand is going to stay constant, then you would raise prices, because if demand stays constant, you raise price, you make more money. And it changes different aspects of the brand. This typically occurs when you have a high level of brand loyalty, or there are no substitutes for the product that you're producing. Example of this, the Green Bay Packers, which is a community-owned team. Essentially, season ticket holders own a share, so to speak, in the Green Bay Packers, which is the reason why the Packers will never leave Green Bay for another city, because the city owns them. There's a high level of loyalty. There's something like 20 years waiting list for a season ticket holder for the Green Bay Packers. All right, high level of loyalty. If they raise prices, in that scenario, they would do it based on cost because they own the company. But let's say they did raise their prices, you may lose a few people off your waiting list, but for the most part, you're still going to sell out. Or there's no substitutes, meaning you're the only game in town, right? And so raising prices in an elastic demand curve would be something like gas prices. Everybody needs gas to get from one place to another. To a certain point, people are still going to buy gas until it's basically going to make them bankrupt, and then obviously they won't buy gas. But so if we look at the inelastic demand curve, there's a lot of reasons why prices are inelastic. For example, a decrease in a price can raise attendance, which can increase a lot of other things. And so, for example, let's say that I do have an inelastic demand curve, and I want to bring more people to the facility. I can decrease or increase prices, try to make more revenue, but I know there's other things they're spending money on. And so you have to keep in mind, as you're starting to change prices, that it may be different based on your demand characteristics, but it's also affecting other revenue sources. So getting into the game, they get in for a cheaper price, may be more willing to spend more money on concessions. It may also add value to your sponsorships. We'll talk about promotion in a little bit, but cheeks and seats and eyeballs on sponsorships increases the value. And when I say cheeks, I don't mean the cheeks on your face. Having people in the facility and eyeballs on their sponsorships increases the value of that sponsorship, and therefore you can charge more of your sponsors. It also increases your fan base, and by lowering prices, you can increase the goodwill you have with your fans. And there's also other reasons why prices are inelastic. An increase in price can do several things at the same time. It can increase your television viewership or decrease it depending on your market. It also affects the team image, the quality of the product. We'll talk about price-quality relationship in another video. And then finally, this last term I want to talk about when we're talking about elasticity is this term unit elastic. In other words, this is a situation in which if you changed your price by 1%, you would see an inverse and equal change in demand. So an example would be increasing your price by 1% would cause a 1% decrease in the quantity that is demanded. And so we're looking at the terms elastic, inelastic, and unit elastic.